We were returning to Ann Arbor after my sojourn at the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation to apprentice under Frank Lloyd Wright. I returned to Ann Arbor to live in an attic working for my previous landlord in order to reduce my expenses. I immediately became a beginning student in architecture, taking architectural courses with many freshmen who perhaps had a better technical background in high school than I had. Most of them had calculus in high school. I had to take calculus in college. It was very tough financially, and after a year I felt I had to drop out and go back to work in the lab full-time. So I worked in the lab full-time doing a new set of biological assays. But in a year I went back to college, went back to the architecture school to complete my degree, and in 1963 I completed my degree. I got married in the same year in May of 1963, and my wife and I lived in the very attic that I was in when I first moved back to Ann Arbor. But now the attic was a very fine apartment up on the 5th story of this building that was on a very busy street that was on the way to the football stadium. So all the activity went right by our door. And I was within 3 blocks of architecture school. I finished up my degree after I was married in 1963, and then began to work in an architectural office in Ann Arbor named KMM Associates. That later, that was Kindlaurie, McMillan, and Millman Associates. Millman had eventually moved to Auburn to become dean at Auburn, and that was to bring me into teaching at Auburn many years later after I'd gotten my architectural license. My wife and I moved from Ann Arbor in 1965 to return to Fairhope, and we took up in a little apartment at my folks' place, which was my old bungalow or the garage where I had grown up. And we lived there a year while I worked in an architectural office in Mobile to accumulate my 3 years of apprenticeship with a licensed architect that was required even before I took my state board exam. I took my state board exam and got licensed. The architectural exams were 7 exams in 5 days, and it was quite common for most architects to not pass all the exams. So it took me 3 trips to the state board exam at Auburn over years, and I got licensed as an architect in 1967. I had since moved to a house on Fish River and began to build it up over the years, and did a substantial remodeling job in 1979 that increased the size and scope of the house. In the meantime, we had 1 child in 1966, and then I just put out a feeler to Auburn that I might teach there, and Dick Millman, who happened to be dean there, wanted me to immediately come to work as in the design course of Auburn. I'd been having rumblings that Auburn was going to better address the common problems of architecture, the more technical problems rather than the design problems that is so emphasized in the architectural schools all over the country. What students really need are the technical skills to go into an architectural office after they graduate and be useful to licensed architects in their drafting team. But they come to the work field with very little technical training. Anyway, I spent a time at Auburn finding out that they weren't too interested in technical work. But I managed to teach a course in lighting and cost estimating of how to design a building within a budget. But I didn't see myself on a long-term track, and I maintained my house on Fish River. So in 1970, with my dad dying, I returned to Fairhope. My dad died within a year, and I continued my work, architectural work in Mobile. I ended up designing public buildings, schools, courthouses, office buildings, and retired in about 1980. I would like to change the subject for myself to tell more about Fairhope during the days that I lived in Fairhope. Fairhope was an ideal town to be brought up in, even if you didn't have any money. I was born in 1933 in the heart of the Great Depression, and within about 2 years, my dad had lost his job with the city of Fairhope as a lineman, and it was a very traumatic event for our family because that was our main cash income. So my family went back to farming, and that meant perfecting a small dairy, a hatchery, and a large volume of chicken houses. My dad and I would milk 4 cows every morning. We'd go down to the barn in boots and with a lantern. We had no electrical lights down there, and we would milk the cows by early morning darkness in the winter. And I always had a problem with going by the rear of the cows to get to my milking station. And my dad would always say, come by, come by. And one day I put the milking bucket between me and the cow, and she kicked a dent in the bucket. And so I was always afraid of the cows kicking out the back. The cow barn was set up where the cows had stalls, and then there was a sluiceway behind for the waste manure and the urine to pass down to the end of the building, and the manure was thrown out the window in a pile outside so it was very stinking. And then I had to clean out chicken houses from time to time, and this hardened me against this kind of work, so that later when I became adult, no kind of dirty work fazed me. But we tried to make a living off of our income from hatching biddies. We'd have to go to Robertsdale in the middle of the night to meet the train to pick up fertile eggs, and then the whole family would then put them in incubators that was located in the basement of our 566 Morphy Avenue house. We had a huge incubator in the main part of the house, and then we had a James Way upright incubator over in a side portion under my parents' bedroom. It was up to the family to manage the eggs during their 3-week incubation and to sort the eggs at a certain time to throw away the ones that were bad, and then when the biddies all hatched out to bring them out of the incubator and put them in cardboard boxes to take out to our customers at the various farms in East Fairhope. We also used these baby chicks to increase our flocks, and we had 3 large hen houses about 80 feet long each, and I'm guessing they each had several hundred chickens in each of them. And it was up to me to feed and water the chickens when I came home from the organic school at noon, and to change the cows. We had to chain the cows because my dad had tried to fence them in, and that just didn't work. They always got away, and he was chasing cows. So we always changed the cows around the pecan trees in the orchard. We had 4 acres of pecan trees. My dad had tried to grow satsumas in the early days of his farming, and they all froze in the freeze of 26, as did all the oranges in Fairhope. They called them oranges, but they were all satsumas. But everybody lost their satsuma trees in those freezes. So then we used the income from our pecan trees and the cows and the chickens and the hatchery. But we were barely making it. And when the Second World War came, my dad went to work in the shipyards, and he thought that $1.65 an hour was big wages, and he got overtime for working on the Liberty boats in the shipyards as a carpenter. At first we had a Model T, and I remember going into Bohemian swimming hole at Fish River in the rumble seat of that Model T coupe with my sister, and I couldn't have been more than 3 years old. And the Model T had on the side of it Homecroft Hatchery, which was the name of our hatchery. Our driveway had a huge sign over the top of the driveway at the Morphy Avenue entrance, and it said Homecroft Hatchery. The hatchery was part of our big business and was a substantial part of our income. I was trying to go to the organic school in between all this, and when my dad went to work in the shipyards, I was left milking the cows because he had to get up early in the morning to get in his ride to Mobile. Eventually we got a Model A, and we would go on picnics to Fish River at the Bohemian swimming hole where I now live, and we'd go to Bailey's Creek, which was south of Point Creer. Bailey's Creek was a very romantic place. It had 2 huge live oak trees that perhaps were 6 to 8 feet in diameter at the trunk that shaded the whole area. We never went in the creek because I think we thought it was full of alligators, which it probably was. But it had also been an Indian camp, and there was potsherd all along the beach where my little girlfriend Helen Stursel and I used to play, and I remember the abundance of Indian potsherd at the bay. But it was a very romantic picnicking place because of the shade and the oak trees. I understand it was also a lover's park, and I did not know it at that time, but we would go to all these different places. I used to clod fight with little George Dyson and spent a lot of time at his house, which was about 1 block down the street from our Laraway leasehold on Morphy Avenue. And his dad worked for the city. His dad was the main coordinator of public utilities for the city, and he was in charge of all the drainage, all the sewage, and all the sidewalks and that sort of thing. So every night he had to check the pumps at the sewage, which was located below the Single Tax Cemetery at the east end of Fairhope, down near the Art Association and the cemetery site. Then we would go on in his pickup truck to Fly Creek, and we would swim while he would throw his net for mullet. And there was nothing at Fly Creek at that time. Across the way was just a swamp, and there was a stump there just as you come down the drive where we dive and swim, and we would swim while he fished. It was a very picturesque Fly Creek at that time, long before the yacht club. And then we would go back in his pickup truck, us in the back, and try to keep warm the best we could, and go back to Fairhope and we would be dropped at the Dyson house at the corner of Morphy and School Street. Mr. Dyson did this almost every night during the summer, and so I was very close to the Dysons. At that time, George Dyson was going to the organic school. I did not realize how close all the Dyson family was to the Single Tax Corporation and to the organic school at that time. But even George was going to the school. The school was heated at that time with wood stoves, just as our family home was heated with the fireplace and then later a wood stove. Everything was very primitive, and after the town generator burned up in 1934, we had to use kerosene lanterns because we had no electricity out on Morphy Avenue, nor did downtown Fairhope. East Fairhope was getting electricity from a line coming down from the generator at Malbus. Eventually, the generator was put back in service, and the generator was located in what is now the tourist reception center. And there was a huge diesel engine there, a single-cylinder diesel engine with a huge flywheel that ran the generator. And I think they turned it off at night, and so it was a single cylinder, and you could hear it starting up. It would start up very slowly with a firing, and that huge flywheel would keep it going, and then they would turn in the generator. Johnny Stapleton, George Dyson's, and my friend, we would go over there in the evening and come up to the plant where his dad would work all night, I think, or at least in the morning, but we would go up there in the evening with his dad to start the generator or to stop the generator for the evening shutdown. Those were my two main playmates were Johnny Stapleton and George Dyson. George was a Roman Catholic and Johnny was a Methodist, and Johnny soon got to taking me to his Methodist Sunday schools, and I eventually became a Methodist because of that. I went to the Methodist Sunday school and church from about the age 10 to my high school days, and but it was merely this association with John Stapleton. His mother was a Kane, and she was a sister to Kenny Kane. So there was always this connection to the organic school, but eventually both the Stapletons and the Dysons took their children out of the organic school, and I think the girls eventually graduated, at least one girl eventually graduated from Fairhope High, as did Johnny. But the life in Fairhope centered around the bay in the summer, and we teenagers would go down to the bay and spend our days with the girls on the wharf, swimming and fishing. Sometimes we would spearfish under the wharf. We'd spearfish for sheepheads by scraping down the barnacles on the posts, and this would attract the sheepheads as well as the dog sharks. And we would use a combination of devices to spear the sheepheads. Some boys erected very elaborate spearfishing systems because in those days there were no commercial spearfishing systems. Very often there were two breakwaters both at the big pier and the boat pier, which was just down the bay a little bit from the big pier. And very often I would climb up on these breakwaters and fish all day for croakers and cats and sheephead, using clams that I had collected off the shallows of the Fairhope beach. That was our main activity during the summer, and then when I became a teenager, we began to go to Burkell's skating rink, which was located at the end of Pier Street, and has since burned down, which burned down in 1952 And I got so I was going there pretty regularly, and I eventually got to go on the weekends and became Mr. Burkell's skate installer. And he would very often take me into his museum. He had a museum at the entry of the Burkell's skating rink that was one long room. And in that room were Indian artifacts, there were Civil War artifacts, there were World War II artifacts, every kind of ancient artifact that you could think of. And he had on the wall the flag of the Kearsarge, and the Kearsarge was from the Yankee ship that sunk the USS Alabama off the coast of France during the Civil War. I am told that he would take a black man out in the woods and just tell him to dig in various Indian sites and Civil War sites, and that's where he got a great deal of his collection. As you entered the skating rink, there was a skate installation room on the right, and it was a big wood floor beyond this, and we helpers would put on the skates for skating free. He had a storage skate room at the end of this installation room where you'd go in and pick out the skates you wanted, and then his helpers, like myself, would put on the skates. We would skate for hours, mainly on Friday nights with our girlfriends and that sort of thing. And then after our skating, I would go home with my girlfriend and sit on our front porch overlooking the bay area just off on Mobile Street, just off White Avenue. At that time, the White Avenue Pier was a very substantial public pier, and very often we'd go out on the White Avenue Pier at night. Fairhope was a very romantic place during the spring, but during the summers it got unbearably hot, and many people who lived along the bay would have to retreat to even out in the wharfs, taking their sleeping gear out on the wharf to just endure the heat. During the teenage years, we would come out to the Bohemian swimming hole to camp and swim, and then we would go down on Buell's Island with the Rockwell family. We'd pass through Clay City and then boat across to Buell's Island, which was about a half a mile below Clay City. And we'd camp there and go up and down the river. There was absolutely no development on the river at that time until you got to Marlow. And at Marlow, there was a general store. Very often we'd boat down to Marlow. We would do a lot of fishing and a lot of swimming at Buell's Island. There was a pulley that went from a tower down into the river, and we'd play on that pulley, take that pulley down into the river very often. Spent a great deal of time there with the Rockwells, and Reuben Rockwells would chaperone us very often, and then later when we got older, he wouldn't come. He was a avid single taxer, and even then, at a very young age, he would lecture us about single tax. One of his favorite phrases I remember he always said at Buell's Island was, "No man should be deprived of the fruits of his income." That was a fundamental single tax idea. He preached single tax and libertarianism at every occasion to everybody he could think. His family, his three sons were all avid single taxers, and at that time were all libertarian Republicans. But Fairhope, people did not have much income, but there was an abundance of places to go for recreation. As I mentioned, Fish River, the Bohemian swimming hole, the Fairhope Wharf, Fly Creek, Devil's Hole. When I reached teenage age during the Second World War, we spent a great deal of time camping above Devil's Hole in Fly Creek. At that time, there was absolutely no development at Fly Creek. It was very idyllic, a black stream that had grass beds along the side. It was excellent fishing, and we'd camp there at night and fish, and we'd catch catfish, and even we caught trout up in there. I cannot bring up the name of the trout, but we'd spend a lot of time fishing and camping in there. So there was an abundance of places to go, even if you didn't have income and money to go places. And at that time, I had a motorbike, and I would do a great deal of fishing, going fishing with Paul Greger, who also had a Whizzer motorbike. And we would take our shotguns for dove hunting and our fishing gear for fishing out to quite a few miles from Fairhope, either at Fish River or towards Malbus, to duck hunt and to dove hunt. We all could hear the rumblings of single tax over our shoulder, even as young kids. At the organic school, as we got into high school, we were taught more and more single tax and history and biology and geometry and chemistry, and we had all the sciences through high school at the organic school as you got to high school, and then it was practically all book learning. During the early years, it was a lot of informal and teachers reading to you and taking nature hikes to the gullies and out wherever we might go, mainly in back of the kindergarten. But as we got to high school, it was almost all book learning, and we did have homework, especially when I took algebra in high school. We had a lot of homework. So this more or less prepared us for college, even though I got turned off for college and decided I wouldn't go, but I was forced by my mother to go to college, and have since become an avid advocate of going to college at whatever cost. My family of 4 now will have 8 college degrees as a result of my change of mind about college. The general tenor of Fairhope was very politically conservative during the 40s, during the Second World War, especially for people who were involved with the Single Tax Corporation and the production of the paper. The paper at that time was edited by a sister of Corney and Ernest Gaston, and she was extremely politically conservative. And my step-grandfather worked there as a printer. His name was Edward G. Doherty. So the atmosphere was very conservative in Fairhope. I wrote a lot of very left-wing articles for the Organic Merry-Go-Round, and we had some quite discussion going between some of the very right-wing contributors of the Fairhope Courier. They began to call us communists at that time, merely because we were advocating more racial equality and more greater rights for the black people. That was very unpopular then. Even though Fairhope was a progressive town, there was a lot of racism, but any elements that wasn't racism was mainly centered around the organic school and a few of the single taxers who were a little bit left-wing. One side of the Gaston family was very right-wing. Corney Gaston was on the left-wing side. He had married into the Nichols family, and the whole Nichols family was very left-wing. Pop Nichols came from Tennessee. He was a Methodist and taught chemistry at the organic school. Marvin Nichols was a delegate to the Progressive Party convention in 1948 and voted for Henry Wallace. But he was an avid single taxer and an avid libertarian. He didn't even like the seatbelt law when it came in, because it restricted his private rights. What is there else about the character of Fairhope? Morphy Avenue wasn't paved. It was a dirt road. Virtually the only streets that were paved were Fairhope Avenue and Section Street. And Section Street only went out to, about Pierce Street as being a case. I don't even think it was paved to Pierce Street on Section Avenue. And it went to Big Head Gully. And we spent a great deal of time in Big Head Gully having BB gun wars in the gully, and clod fighting in the gully, but it was a favorite place to go for all the kids, both Davis and Big Head Gully, but it was, Big Head Gully was the better place because it was large and it had a cliff. Well, both gullies had cliffs. But anyway, the only paved streets were those two streets. Maybe White Avenue was paved at that time. Fairhope was graded by the county grader about once a month and would have big ruts in it. Our cows had to be freshened from time to time, and this meant mating with a bull that was housed at the Gwendon place, which is, the Gwendon house was located, the farm was located on what is now Bishop Street that goes by one side of the satellite courthouse. I would have to walk the cow out, the female cow out there to be serviced by that bull at the Gwendon place. Sometime my dad would try to fasten the cow to the back of the bumper of the Model A cow, but when we got to Greeno Road, which was a dirt road at that time, the cow would balk and I'd have to get out of the cow and switch her to make her go on. But as I got older, I would have to take the cow out there alone to be freshened. Well, when the cow had a calf, if it were a male, we would butcher the male in the backyard by the cow barn. And the agreement was that Gwendon would get part of the meat, and otherwise, if it was a female heifer, then we would get the calf. But very often we'd get a male and we'd butcher the male, and my mother, Mr. Gwendon would shoot the calf with a .22, and then my dad would hang it up feet first, just like a deer, and it would be skinned and degutted there by my dad and Mr. Gwendon. And then my mother would step in and cut up the cuts to go in the refrigerator. And Mr. Gwendon, I think, would take the bottom half of the calf, and we would take the choice cuts from the chest area. We would butcher chickens on Saturdays weekly, and for our commercial selling of chickens, and that the whole family was involved in the butchering. My mother would after my dad had cut the chicken's head cut off, would dip the chickens in a boiling hot black pot over an open fire, and then throw them over to the side, then throw them to the children to dress, and then take them in the house. I've already discussed this, but that was one of the rituals of our family, to try to eke out a very modest living at that time. All the time I had been saving for college, nickels and dimes and dollars. My grandfather, Kester, would come to the house once a week on Sunday, and if I would walk down the walk and shake his hand, he would give me one crisp new dollar, and I would take it in and put it in my Lipton tea can savings bank for college. I didn't know what college was, but we were saving for college, and every once in a while my mother would take the cash down to the Fairhope Bank and put it in the cash book savings account. Of course, in those days, the passbooks earned practically nothing, but we saved and saved from my earliest days for me to go to college. I don't think my sisters were ever thought to go to college because they thought they would be lucky if they could get one child through college. I think my sisters somewhat resented me for that because they weren't able to go to college and I was. But that was the circumstances, and very few people were able to afford college in those days. And the male child in the house was expected to go to college at least to earn a living. And so I was the one that eventually went to college. Fairhope Avenue was paved to Greeno, I think. At the corner of Greeno was the Busy Bee Garage, and across the street was a large milling place where they milled corn and other grains for private consumption. And they ran it off the flywheel of a tractor at the time that I saw it, at least. But it is located on the corner of Greeno Boulevard and Fairhope Avenue on the south side of the street. And very often we would go in there to get our corn milled. 1,000 feet south on Fairhope Avenue. My dad had bought the lot from a black man, and it still had pine stumps on it when he bought it. And he paid extra for the black man to take out the stumps so he could farm it. We put it in clover and that sort of crop, and we would go out after the clover had matured, and my dad would hand scythe the clover, and then he had a rake that was pulled behind the horse that would rake it up in piles. This was 4 acres, so it was a considerable amount of hay. And then when the hay was dried on the ground, the Ratty family, which was my aunt's family, would come in and assist us of throwing the hay up on the horse-drawn wagon, and we'd take the wagon back by moonlight to the Morphy Avenue farm to put in our barn there. East Fairhope, between Fairhope Avenue and Morphy Avenue, was almost entirely housed by and farmed by Quakers. There were a few exceptions on Fairhope Avenue, but originally the corner of Morphy and Greeno Road was a bird sanctuary. Some woman established a bird sanctuary there, but during the Depression it got unsupported and it eventually ran down. Just beyond the bird sanctuary, just beyond the holding pond today, beyond the shopping center today, was Hubert Mendenhall's farm, and it extended to what is now Bishop Street, and part of it is one of his fields is where the Unitarian Church is today. So his leasehold extended to Bishop and over to Fairhope Avenue, and he needed that much to grow hay for his dairy herd. He had an extensive dairy herd of Holstein cows, which at that time was the most best type of breed of cow to have. We had Guernsey cows in our herd. He had Holstein cows. Now this would be into the 40s. And beyond Bishop Street was the Gwendon House. He was also an old Quaker. And I could see him coming to his Quaker meeting in a black, he was a very tall man. He would come dressed all in black, and he had a bow tie on and a pork pie hat, which was the Quaker traditional garb for Sunday meetings. But he was a farmer, and he had a silo there and a bull, and he did various sorts of farming. Just beyond that was the Walter James house. He was also a Quaker. And that extended down to, his leasehold extended down to, I think, the low place that occurs on the east. Across the street from this was the Burmeister farm. They were not Quakers, they were old Germans, but they were a very important family in Fairhope, and they farmed almost everything south of Morphy Avenue in that area. Beyond the Burmeister farm was the Reuben Rockwell leasehold, which was very extensive. It extended from what is now Highway 13 to the low place to the east, and I don't know how many acres of it was his leasehold, but it was very substantial. He had a very large pecan orchard on the east and south side of the road, and on the west side of the road he raised corn and various things like that over to the Fairhope Avenue side. On the Fairhope Avenue side, there was a swamp in the middle of it, and on west of that swamp, I know he farmed corn because I was behind the horse-drawn plow when I was a teenager there, plowing the field and harvesting the corn just across from the Quaker meeting house. Reuben Rockwell was originally a Quaker, but he married a Roman Catholic, and they read him out of the Quaker meeting because of that. But he was always a Quaker by tradition, but he was more avidly single tax than almost Quaker. But later he came back to Quakerism. He was always a Quaker in temperament, even though he'd been read out of the meeting. This was very common in those days, that if you didn't marry somebody in the meeting or bring the wife into the meeting, this was also common in the Catholic Church. Many religious groups had this practice. He was read out of the meeting, and he just, after he married Helen Bell, he stayed out of the meeting. But virtually all the way to the little low place there on Morphy Avenue, there's a bridge across there. I don't know how you characterize it. It was leased to Quakers and was single tax land. I think single tax land went beyond that all the way out to what is now Highway 180 and beyond, 181, I'm sorry, so that all that was single tax land at that time. There were a few Quakers north of Fairhope Avenue, the Frees, and I forgot who else had some single tax leasehold who were also Quakers out beyond what is now Highway 181. Out Highway 181, which was an unpaved road at that time, all the way to Fish River, just beyond what is now the entry to a subdivision and beyond Walmart, where began the Czechoslovak settlement. My brother-in-law, Urbanik, had a 20-acre leasehold, 20-acre deeded land there, and still owns that land just beyond the low place, beyond Walmart and the subdivision there. Across the street on Fairhope Avenue began the Bishop's land, and the Bishops owned one side of the Bishop family, owned almost from that low place on Fairhope Avenue on out. Various bishops had farms all the way to the Clay City Road, which is Highway 33. They had lands on Fairhope Avenue, both just beyond Highway 33 and across Fairhope Avenue. The down slope to get to Fish River at the bottom of the hill was Pensacola Creek, and at that time there was just a rough wooden bridge across the creek, and when there was floodwaters it would flood the road, so you could not get across the road there. Eventually Roy Buckwright's father, who as county engineer, dynamited out the Pensacola Creek and made it low and put in a bridge. Then beyond was a wooden bridge at Fish River, and everything was a dirt road at that time. Silver Hill Highway was paved even in the 30s, but the early 30s it was not. It was a dirt road up from Fish River. When they rebought the replacement generator, when the Fairhope generator burned up in town, they brought it from the train in Robertsdale, and Mr. Buckright had to use the Caterpillar to pull the truck up hauling the generator up the Fish River hill to get the heavy generator into Fairhope. So the generator that I knew in Fairhope as a youth was a second generator. The first generator had burned up. I could not understand for a long time why we had to use kerosene lanterns. Our leasehold had the only windmill that was in town, and we pumped our own water for a while until we got hooked up eventually to city water. Things were very primitive. You could hear the ice plant during the early days. We'd bring in would be delivered huge chunks of ice to put in our refrigerators to cool the refrigerator. Eventually, we got an electric refrigerator, a GE electric refrigerator, to put our milk and cheese and butter in. I'm trying to remember other things about Fairhope that may not be recorded. We would go to Devil's Hole. Devil's Hole was a famous place for teenagers to go, and I guess it was also a lover's park. But it was rumored that a boy drowned there trying to make a primitive diving equipment, and that it was a very deep hole. As a teenager, I went down there, and it couldn't have been more than 15 feet deep when I hit the bottom, maybe even 12 feet. It wasn't as deep as it was reported to be, but the stream there was reported to be very deep, and we would camp in that area, or we'd go swimming at the Devil's Hole. Our camping place was just down from what we called the Y, and the Y was the V where the road came in from Silver Hill, Highway 104, and it would V for the road to go to Montrose and the road to go to Fairhope. And that was all very primitive at that time. In fact, there was a wooden bridge across Fly Creek going up to Sea Cliff. During the summers, we would go up to Sea Cliff to picnic on top of Sea Cliff at the home of the Smiths. The Smiths had a house almost at the end of the cliff road, and the road went right along the edge of the cliff, and from time to time the cliff would cave off into the bay and push the road back. But there was one black lady that lived there permanently just as you came in from the Fly Creek Road going to Montrose. But otherwise, it was only summer people that lived up there. The Jess Smith family apparently rented a house there almost at the end of the road going down to what is Fly Creek today. There was no road to Fly Creek on that side of the creek at that time. That road came in, the paved road that services all the housing that is on the north side of Fly Creek, came in about 1952. I used to take my girlfriend up there after dances to see Mobile and the Mobile Bay from Sea Cliff. You could just walk in from the road to the cliff there. There was no housing there in 1953. Eventually, that all got built up with housing. When we would visit the Smiths there for a potluck supper, they had stairs down to the bay with several rest landings as you came up, as maybe two other people had there on the cliff. But there was virtually nothing there on the cliff between Fly Creek and Rock Creek. Some people knew that as Sugarloaf rather than Sea Cliff, but generally it was called Sea Cliff. Sea Cliff, Rock Creek into what is now Montrose. It was gradually eroding back to the east because of the prevailing west winds washing against the shore, but it had long been a landmark as you came into the bay. The Spanish explorers, when they first came into the bay in 1519, the first thing they noticed was Sea Cliff as they looked up the bay on the eastern shore. The second thing they noticed was the huge pine trees, and they did the tall pines for masts for their boats. And so they looked at the eastern shore for the timber, and they used the Sea Cliff as a landmark. Unfortunately, the way the bay was up, you couldn't get low draft boats in close to the shore. So you either had to put wharves way out where you could get to fairly deep water, and that's why we had all the wharves along Mobile Bay. During the Civil War, there were 3 wharves put out into the bay. One was a pontoon bridge type temporary wharf to service the military action at Spanish Fort. Most or all the ordnance was brought in at the Daphne set of wharfs that then it was taken by horse-drawn wagon around the Spanish Fort. There was a considerable battle at Spanish Fort that these wharfs serviced during the Civil War period. At that time, there was very little housing development on the bay, but the Old Methodist Church was there, and what is now based Academy was there somewhat, and there were other houses. After a Union boat got sunk by a lucky shot from the shore of the eastern shore down near Bailey's Creek, Admiral Farragut ordered his boats to come along the eastern shore and shell whatever houses he could see as retaliation for sinking of the Union boat, so that a house at where the Grand Hotel is and a house near Daphne got shelled. And I think there's still some record of the shelling of those various houses during the Civil War period in April of 1865. But the base was basically undeveloped, and everybody had free access to the bays and rivers even into the early 50s. We didn't need public places to go because so much of it was open, all the way down to Bailey's Creek on the south, Fish River on the east, and Devil's Hole and Fly Creek and the Sea Cliff area on the north. And everybody used these sites to picnic and to camp and to swim, even into the 50s. Sometimes we would go to the Gulf, and below Foley was a dirt road to the Gulf, and below what is now the dog leg and the bay was all dirt road, and sometimes you would get stuck on these roads. I went with somebody else to the Gulf, I think in the 30s, a sandy dirt road, and I remember we headed down one of the little creeks there to get water for a Model A car that was going to the Gulf in. And that was my first experience in the Gulf and the salty water. approximately 1938, when I went down there with Marvin Nichols' family. He, at that time, had a Model A, but the roads were very primitive in the 30s, even to the 59 to the Gulf. My dad and I, as